Hey guys, it's History Behind the Warrior, and welcome to yet another Mortal Kombat video. Now, seeing as we are at the end of Mortal Kombat 11's lifespan, meaning that there will be no future updates or DLC, I thought that strictly for funsies, we could talk about who we may see in the next game. Yeah, trust me, I know, we're probably really far away from that release, but I wanted to do it anyway, as there's actually a fair bit of foreshadowing in 11 for what we could get in 12. With this said, it should be pretty clear from this video that it will be revolving around the Liu Kang ending of Mortal Kombat 11 in Aftermath, where Shang Tsung and Kronika have been defeated, and the timeline is now reset by the Shaolin. In this new era of Mortal Kombat, we have dialed back the clock to the era of the Great Kung Lao, a timeline that actually exists 500 years before the events of the first game, so it is quite the callback and a very interesting start and direction for the series, as we've only ever heard of the Great Kung Lao, but never really explored what happened to him in the main canon, or in this case, new canon. The only time the Great Kung Lao had ever been explored was in the Mortal Kombat Conquest TV series, which of course was a spin-off from the main canon, and apparently in line with the canon of the 1995 movie, so it did act as a prequel for the character, but of course it didn't line up with the main canon, and this series would later be abandoned, as it would only survive one season. Now mind you, once again, quick reminder, 12's development has not been announced, and at most is probably in extremely early development as we speak. So I want to reaffirm this point, this video is completely for funsies, and nothing here should be taken as gospel or serious in any way, shape and form. I'm simply analysing what we do have for what we could see if we are dialing back the clock. Now, with these pretty heavy resets going on in the canon, I wanted to talk about all the characters who are somewhat contenders to appear in the next game. So this will vary from character to character, and I'll go into detail on whether or not I actually think it's possible for them to make it in. We won't be covering literally everyone. Dear lord, are there too many characters in this series, but we'll be going over some of the more iconic fan favorites, as well as some characters from the 3D era of games, as a lot of them didn't actually appear in the rebooted trilogy. So with a new era ushered in, I will be talking about a fair few of them here, but I can most certainly see turning up. Now, for this video to really work, I will be taking into account a lot of foreshadowing that we did get in 11's arcade endings, as well as the ability of certain individuals, like demigods or someone who has been granted immortality. We also must take into account who has created this new timeline, with it being shaped and molded by Fire God Liu Kang. If it's in his vision, I doubt he would bring someone back like Shang Tsung or Shao Kahn, and because of this, it actually in turn kind of opens up the floor for a new enemy to arise, or more so a old one that we haven't seen in a long time. You can probably guess who I'm talking about, but we'll get to him. Now with that said, I'm definitely not gonna rule out the idea that Shang and Shao are completely out of the picture, but I'm just saying, if I was to remake an entirely new timeline, I wouldn't bring back those two, because guess what, one of them killed you in a previous timeline, and the other one definitely nearly did do that, and that was in 11. So yeah, I don't see Liu making that mistake, and if he does, then that's just bad writing. So first things first, let's talk about the character that will be taking the lead role, and that is of course none other than the Great Kung Lao. This pretty much goes without saying, as it seems like the game series will be focused around his story and legend. Once again, the vague nature of the era he fought in is really kind of open for storytelling. It's never been touched on, and there's tons of source material to work with. One of the things that unfortunately 11 couldn't juggle quite well is handling a new story as well as legacy. In this game, you are basically kind of doing both, but the story is now set in the past, allowing you to work off the building blocks that are there. So we could see some very interesting stuff with the Great Kung Lao. We can see how he forged his legend, and how he rose up to be Earthrealm's best. Who knows, maybe in this iteration, he may not fall to the hands of Goro or Ashokan, something that actually was kind of hinted in Kung Lao's ending in Mortal Kombat 11, where the arrogant Shaolin monk undid Goro's victory against his ancestor, and thus allowed Kung Lao to unite the realms and overthrow Shao Kahn. So we very well could see a version of that here. Now, I think this is a fair assumption, and that is that Liu Kang will return. However, with his role as Overseer of Time, he will more than likely be playing an absent role from the story, more of a passive one. It's hinted at in his arcade ladder ending that upon defeating Kronika, he would bestow godhood upon his allies, meaning that the likes of Kung Lao, Kitana, Raiden, and even Bo Rai Cho would be the new Elder Gods, overseeing the realms and seeing what direction they would go in. If we're back to a somewhat Mortal Kombat tournament format, I'm not sure if it would really make sense for someone as powerful as Liu Kang to take part in the tournament or even really be playable for the most part. I'm not sure if that sounds very fair, considering the power scaling between mortals and literally a fire god that controls time. But then again, power scaling has never really mattered too much in Mortal Kombat, so we will see. But yes, I can see Liu Kang being in this game, along with Kung Lao, Kitana, Raiden, and Bo Rai Cho acting as overseers of the tournament. That to me kind of makes sense narratively. Now the next part is quite interesting here, and I'm going to be dialing the clock back a little bit more. But if you remember correctly, all the way back in MKX, there is in fact a mural in the Sky Temple that displays pictures of fighters from the past. If we take a closer look at them, this could possibly hint at what we could see in the following installments. On the left hand side, we do see the infamous trio of Shaolin fighters produced by the White Lotus. But on the right, we have something very different and interesting. Going from left to right, what we have here appears to be an ancestor of Johnny Cage. Whilst we may not know about Cage's predecessors, we do know that the green energy is a very dangerous tool if it's used in the right capable hands. And we do know that this green energy has been passed down for a very long time, as it does derive from a Mediterranean war cult that were basically created to fight gods. Now one thing we must notice here is of course the dress attire of the individual, somewhat indicating possibly a military focused background. And if we take a look at the facial structure as well as the goggles on his head, this is without a doubt a fairly recent ancestor of the Cage bloodline. So I without a shadow of a doubt feel like we will see an ancestor of Cage in this era, but I don't think it will be this version of Cage. As from the clothes alone, this seems like a Vietnam War era version of Johnny Cage. But once again, the green energy has been established, so there are other fighters that can pick up that mantle. So I'm sure that there's someone that has inherited the green energy. Now our next fighter here is a head tattooed individual of the Lin Kuei, who is clearly manipulating ice. Now this should pretty much go without saying as who this is, but this is obviously an ancestor of the cryomancers of the series. The real question is it an ancestor of Kuai Liang and Bi Han's, or is it one of Frost's? Now there's very little we can actually talk about with this individual. The question is, how long ago was this picture taken, and was this from the early era of the Lin Kuei? Now it should pretty much go without saying that whoever this is, if this is the character they're going with, will probably end up being in the game, because what's Mortal Kombat without a blue or a yellow ninja, right? That goes without saying. Now our third and final picture here is an unknown woman bearing the blade of Sento, whilst of course blindfolded. Again, this should be fairly obvious, but this is of course supposedly an ancestor of Kenshi. What's quite interesting here is that we've always heard of the Takahashi bloodline, but it's never really been explored properly. We just know that they've been referred to as a long line of warrior kings who fought with the legendary blade Sento and passed it down from generation to generation. And we've only ever seen this one picture of her. So I personally would be very interested to see if she were to be included in the following game, to learn more about the Takahashi bloodline and what is her story, as she is seemingly blind much like Kenshi. I could 110% see Takeda appearing in this game. No, not quite that Takeda. You see, since we're going quite far back in time now, a fun bit of trivia that many of you might not actually know is that the individual that formed the Shiraryu was a man by the name of Takeda. Takeda was a man that studied stayed under the Lin Kuei for many years, but decided to break away from the clan as he found their teaching methods and rules to be barbaric. So he returned back home to Japan and transformed their secret techniques into his own style of combat. Naturally, this ruffled many feathers and did spark a war between the Shirai Ryu and the Lin Kuei. This was a fight that would go on for a sufficient amount of time, with the Shirai Ryu wearing yellow garbs in order to somewhat mock them for their use of blue. Now tragically, Takeda would die shortly after forming the Shirai Ryu after he had his tea poisoned, so his reign was very short. However, despite this, it did not destroy his legacy, and if anything, cemented his teaching, beliefs, and disdain towards the bitter nature of the Lin Kuei. I could see Takeda appearing in this game. The Shirai Ryu are an ancient clan, not one that quite meets the measure of the Lin Kuei, but one that has been prominent in the series for a very long time. And if you still want to do the evil revenant coming back from the dead, you still could most certainly do that, because he did get assassinated. So no doubt in my mind that there still would be some bitterness between the two clans, especially if he came back from the dead. So that can be written in. Now something that was very briefly foreshadowed, and I can most certainly see it happening, is the inclusion of Nightwolf. Now something we did learn in Mortal Kombat 11 is that Nightwolf isn't a name but more of a mantle that has been passed down the Matoka. In Nightwolf's arcade ladder ending, we did see a female Nightwolf, showing that this mantle had to have come from somewhere and has been passed on from generation to generation. So with that said, I can see a Nightwolf appearing in this era of games, and with how well respected the Matoka are, and the fact that they do take pride in protecting Earthrealm and basically the spirit world itself, I think that a Nightwolf would be a great inclusion amongst the roster. Now we're going to start juggling with some of the antagonists and other characters that we could see here, and we're going to start off with probably the most obvious one, and that is Goro. We've always seen the somewhat blood feud between Kung Lao and Goro. This goes all the way back to the original set of Mortal Kombat games, which showed a rivalry between the two, but we never really saw the spark that ignited that. This game would be a fantastic way of actually seeing how the great Kung Lao actually stacked up against Goro. Now the reason why I'm not 100% solid on Goro is much so like my reasoning for Shang as well as Shao Kahn. Like, Liu Kang's gone up against Goro a fair few times and knows what the prince is capable of, so I'm not entirely sure if we would see him here, but I think his inclusion is very much so important to the legend of the great Kung Lao. It was Goro that slayed the great Kung Lao and went on the victory streak that Liu had to break. These characters are all kind of tied to each other, so I feel like it's very important for the prince to be included here. Again, a lot of this is respecting the origins and legacy of the game. Once again, this is respecting the origin of this series, and I feel like Goro's a key component of this. So the inclusion of Goro pretty much goes without saying. I think they could introduce a new Shogun, but I feel like it'd be far more wise to go with the prince. Now our next character, who I would somewhat label as the main big villain, is someone that we've all kind of been yearning for to appear, and it's none other than the Dragon King Onaga. Now why does Onaga work here? As I mentioned before, it would be unwise for Liu Kang to include the likes of Shang Tsung and Shao Kahn, but how does Onaga slip through his grasp? Well, Onaga specifically has never directly actually come into conflict with Liu Kang in the original and rebooted canon. In fact, Onaga was completely absent from Mortal Kombat 9 to 11 and only mentioned in name through intros. Onaga's name has been lost to time, and really, he has been forgotten. Along with this, with the Mortal Kombat X comic book line having been retconned, the character hasn't been touched upon since Armageddon. So what a better way of reintroducing that character than opening up the floor and having him break through it. With Shao Kahn out the picture, that may mean that Onaga had never been poisoned. Maybe he went on to continue his quest and was interested in obtaining immortality through Mortal Kombat. There's multiple different ways you can really thread and weave this idea that actually works to the Dragon King's favor. If you want to really push things and really try to like exceed that power scale, you could always make Onaga attempt to become the one being through Mortal Kombat, much like Shao did in the original games. Now that we're dealing with somewhat Titan level beings, there's no excuse to not really use what you have in your source material to your favor, especially if you're bringing back a character like Onaga. Onaga's fantastic, but you got to give him some form of motivation that allows him to achieve his goal. I think Onaga would be a great way to kick off this new era of games, as he's always been a formidable and imposing force in the series. Now with that out the way, let's somewhat talk a little bit about the goons that we could go up against. One would definitely have to be Baraka, because I suppose every game needs a Baraka or Takatan you need to beat up. Now in saying that, Baraka has always been a fan favorite of the series. He's always had a very metal overkill design that naturally will catch your attention. Whilst I don't always consider Baraka to be a fantastic choice, he's a great safe pick. Fan favorite, great design, interesting combat, not everyone can emulate what he does. Plus with Takata now being a part of Outworld, it would only be natural for him to fall in line with what his master wants him to do. Now since we mentioned Onaga, again we do need another lackey, I can actually see Reptile appearing here, because believe it or not, Visarion is incredibly old. Visarions were born of course at the dawn of time, when the realm started to breathe life into existence. So whilst Reptile definitely doesn't look old in game, his lifespan probably does contend with that of Edenians. So once again, I can see Reptile being in this game, and whilst he's never played that big of a role, especially if Onaga never died, he still is a safe pick for a good character on the roster. Now if the Elder Gods are too busy overseeing the realms, and Liu Kang is weaving the Hourglass of Time, who becomes its new protector? Well, I actually see Fujin picking up this role. This was a role given to him at the end of Mortal Kombat 4, but we did not see him between then up to Armageddon, as he was largely absent when the Deadly Alliance struck. Here, with Raiden being an Elder God, and Liu Kang weaving the Hourglass of Time, for Fujin to finally step up to the board and take up his role as protector of Earthrealm. It would make sense for the character, as we have seen with Aftermath, he can play that role very well. So I would like to see Fujin's inclusion here, and with him of course being a god, he isn't bound by the natural shackles of mortality or time. He can basically exist forever. Now if I'm taking Shao off the roster, there needs to be someone that kind of picks up that mantle where he left off, and who better than Outworld's general, Reiko. Reiko has always been one of those somewhat underground fan favorites that's really gained some popularity in the last few years. I believe that's from his inclusion in the Mortal Kombat X comics, along with his subpar inclusion in the Mortal Kombat live action movie, to his upcoming appearance in Battle of the Realms. The character's got a lot of love in the last few years, so I think we could all capitalize off that and see it come to fruition in this future installment. With Reiko being an Outworlder himself, he does age at a much slower rate than that of mortals, so I think it'd be a very wise choice to have him be included on a roster here. Now another character that I think we could possibly see is Jade's mother. I know this might be like coming out of left field a little bit, but please do hear me out. You see, we got our first hint at a mysterious individual at the end of Jade's arcade ladder ending in Mortal Kombat 9, and we were told numerous times that this character was of great importance, something that didn't really come to fruition in Mortal Kombat 11, as we simply just learnt the identity of this individual, and that is Jade's mother. Now on the surface, this may come across as a tragically executed idea, but really there's actually a lot of potential with this idea and concept. You see, Jade herself actually comes from a long line of warrior guards that protected the royal Edenian bloodline, meaning that they guarded the likes of King Jared and Queen Sindel. So we know for a fact that Jade's mother was indeed very much so capable in hand-to-hand combat. To what extent is the true question, something that we do not know here. It's always been hinted at that something was gonna go on with this character, and with the somewhat scarce known nature of Jade's family's origins, they could really use that here to make something interesting. So I think that if there is a story that takes place 500 years before the events of the first game, in a completely new era, this would be a great way to introduce a new Edenian to the series, and someone that could be a very strong ally to Earthrealm. This is a theory at best. We are simply paying homage to the ideas before. And if we're talking about ideas, we can even include the like of Kotal Ketz, Kotal Khan's father introduced in the Mortal Kombat X comic book series. He played an incredibly small role there, but was pivotal in the feud between KOTOR and Goro. And again, if we're dialing things back a bit, we can see if Ket actually had an influence on Earthrealm itself, as KOTOR influenced the Aztecs with traditional forms of Aztec culture, and with the comics being retconned, you could write Ket in many different ways. So from what you can tell, there's plenty of ancestors to work with in the Mortal Kombat universe. Now, one character that would be very interesting here is actually Li Mei. Li Mei, at the start of the original 3D era of games, was kind of dubbed and created to be the new Liu Kang, but for Outworld. She fought for her people and tried to have it so she could actually protect them from the likes of the Deadly Alliance, who of course were at the time harvesting the villagers' souls. This of course would all go completely belly up as they would betray her, but it was a very noble journey she did go on, and this idea and plan can most certainly translate over to this, just with Onaga now holding said control. Now, I do have two final inclusions here, but I don't really see how they would fit into this story of Earthrealm against Outworld, but Havoc and Hotaru. If you know me, you know for a fact I'm a big fan of the Order Realm and Chaos Realm, and I think they are very unique in the grand scope of Mortal Kombat. Along with this, both of these two are kind of immortal and exist since the dawn of time. They are ideas that have been given life in the form of chaos and order. And if we're going with Onaga here, then it wouldn't be the first time that Hotaru has actually worked with Onaga, as he aligned himself with the Dragon King in Deception, and I can see that happening again. Havoc, on the other hand, has always kind of slipped between the cracks here. At most, Havoc caused the most anarchy during the X comic book series that again have been tragically retconned, so I don't really know how they would fit into this story narratively. I like both of these characters, but I'm trying to make both the roster and the story make sense. If it was up to my choice, I would have the two in a roster regardless. Now, this for the most part somewhat sums up my grand selection. I know I'm probably missing many fan favorites and ideas, such as the Lin Kuei cyborgs, or Nitara, who actually kind of does fit into this format since she's a vampire and immortal. But my point is, there's tons of characters in the Mortal Kombat series that can actually fit into this era of games. The lore and series is so rich, and the characters are very old, that almost anyone could appear in this new era. But I wanted to be somewhat realistic with some of the ideas that I do have at hand here. Legacy is important in Mortal Kombat. Let's not forget the origins of characters and show and respect where they've come from. I could include characters like Cassie, Aaron Black, and Kung Jin, but I don't want to use something like time travel, as I feel like that would be a cheap add-on to the story that adds absolutely nothing to the narrative, and if anything, takes it away from the great Kung Lao's story. Remember, this era of games has him at the forefront. Whilst I've clearly pointed out there are other characters that can accompany him on his journey, I wanted to make it so that he was important to the story. He is what the story should revolve around. I mean, we've been hyping up this character for like 11 games, right? Let's have a decent payoff, and I definitely think this is the way to go. But anyway guys, that has been it for this video. I do apologize for it going on for a very long amount of time, but from what you can tell, I have a lot of ideas in my head for how 12's story could possibly pan out, and a roster that could be a part of it. I like to think I'm quite knowledgeable when it comes to the Mortal Kombat universe and the individuals that live there. We must also keep in mind characterization, as well as the fact that we do have to be a little bit self-aware when it comes to Mortal Kombat. There are certain expectations and forms of realism, but we must keep in mind, we can't have every roster be the size of Armageddon, and hope it's opened your eyes to the somewhat possibilities that do exist in the universe that you might not be aware of. The lore is rich, there's tons to work with, and I really do hope to see that be used in the following game if we're dialing it that far back. But until then guys, that has been it for me. So if possible, before this video wraps up, let's try getting it to about 500 likes, and please do not forget to subscribe and tick that bell, as it will keep you up to date with all of my videos. But until then, that has been it for me. So now, as always guys, please comment, like, subscribe, and share this video with everyone you know. Please take care, and I'll see you all next time.